He closed his address with a statement that there were those present who should not die until they saw the Son of Man coming in his kingdom with power. Perhaps it just wasn't in the way that people objectively wanted, right? I do not know what he meant. Did his disciples, did any event ever occur in their lifetime which corresponds with this statement? If so, where is it recorded? Let us remember that there are different versions, a lot of different versions of the canonical Gospels, and there are 80 other Gospels that are found now. I know what theories have been propounded in explanation. Now, it's not a theory if it's, speculating about the gaps. Have read the commentators, am familiar with the views of theologians, and perhaps have a theory of my own. But the plain question, to be honestly answered, would amount to this. As each man in that company died, if he had been asked in his last moments whether he had seen any event which was to him a fulfillment of these words of Jesus, could he have designated any such event? If he could, we have no means of ascertaining the fact. Well, if you're going to put it in a Christian context of somehow proving his divinity rather than being a miracle worker or a prophet or a sermon giver or whatever, then perhaps people could have assumed that, you realize it, just like people are supposed to realize our experience as if the crucifixion and resurrection were, for them. So that's kind of what they mean, right? We start chapter 28, chapter 3 of part 5, the Transfiguration. It was about a week after the confession made by Peter that an event of great interest as a fresh revelation occurred in the history of Jesus. The narrative, as collected from all the New Testament historians, is this. And we have Matthew 17, Mark 9, and Luke 9. So where's John? But of course, John isn't really a historian. He rewrites the text about Bacchus and puts in Jesus, and something like 90-something% the same. They made it bigger, but still it's a sort of text. All the Gospels got bigger in their various versions. Jesus took Peter, James, and John into a high mountain apart. Remember, these people who wrote the biblical text weren't the same ones mentioned in the story. As he prayed, he was transfigured before them. The fashion of his countenance was altered, and his face shone like the sun, and his raiment became shining and white as the snow, white as the light, whiter than any earthly fuller could make them. Moses and Elijah were present and talking with Jesus, who had a glorious appearance, and they spoke of his death at Jerusalem, which he should accomplish. A fuller's a guy who washes things, right? The 3 disciples were heavy with sleep, but this vision kept them awake by his splendor. As Moses and Elijah departed, Peter said unto Jesus, Sir, it is good for us to be here. And if thou wilt, I will make here 3 tents, one for thee, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He spoke at random, for he was greatly scared. While he was speaking, the awe of the disciples was increased by the overspreading of a bright cloud, out of which came the words, This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased, hear him. And Jesus wasn't the first that this was sort of thing happened with. It's just, and wasn't the first that people literally thought was a deity because of it. But in the context, you would say, no, that's not what it was. I mean, the context of him being a Hebrew and all that other stuff. But this splendor And these words overpowered them, and they fell on their faces, greatly afraid. And when the voice was past, Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise, and be not afraid. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no man but Jesus. As they came down from the mountain, his disciples asked him why the scribes taught that Elijah must first come. His answer was, Elijah truly shall come and restore all things. But I say unto you that Elijah is come already, and they knew him not. Seder? Sidon. Lighthouses were pretty much the standard thing back in the day. We have Mount Hermon. Be careful with this book here. But have done to him whatever they wished. Thus also is the Son of Man about to suffer by them. The disciples understood him to mean John the Baptist in this last speech, and they descended from the mountain. Jesus charged them, saying, Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man be risen from the dead. Luke and Mark say that the injunction was obeyed. The disciples did not tell anything of the vision outside their own circle, but inside they held discussion of the meaning of the perplexing phrase, risen again from the dead. It would appear that the intimation of his sufferings and death had a depressing effect upon the mind of his disciples. Under this cloud they struggled and questioned their own hearts for the space of a week, when the event of the Transfiguration gave new form to their thoughts and hopes. Well, it would have given people reason for faith if the prediction was out there and it came true. It is not known precisely what mountain was the site of this transfiguration. In the 4th century, from a passing remark by Cyril of Jerusalem, tradition fixed on Mount Tabor in Galilee, famous for the beauty of its form and for the wide view of central Palestine beheld from its summit. In the 6th century, 3 churches were built on its top, suggested by Peter's idea of 3 booths. Subsequently, a monastery was founded, but later criticism has displaced the claims of Tabor. It was possible for Jesus, by a very forced march, of which we have no account, to reach Tabor within the period specified. But why should he return to Galilee when his enemies were seeking him to destroy him? Mark 9:30 informs us that he did not go into Galilee after this event. Moreover, Tabor was occupied to its summits by settlements, and had been probably from the time of Joshua. Jesus was in the highlands of Galanites, in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Whoever in this place looks up for a high mountain immediately sees the sublime heights of Hermon, and the almost common consent of travelers and critics is now given to the theory that the Transfiguration took place somewhere on Hermon. Well, when you're writing a gospel, you gotta bounce it off the beliefs of the sacred landscape, don't you? Or at least that's an option of what you can do. Jesus had with him the 3 representative and trusted disciples, Peter and James and John. It was his custom to go into the mountains for the evening prayer and sometimes to continue his devotions through the entire night. He seems to have done so in this instance. He prayed while his fatigued disciples slept. At some period of the night, a strange awe infused their slumbers. They awoke to see their master in a state of glorification. His face shone like the sun, and his very garments were glistening, snowy white and luminous. Mark was struck with that fact, which must have been narrated to him by one of the spectators. So, see, again, Mark wasn't a witness to the Jesus story. And a simple remark in that they were white as no fuller on earth can white them. This was the first stage of the marvel. Then 2 unknown men stood with him. They entered into solemn discourse with Jesus. The disciples learned from the lofty conversation that these were Moses and Elias, the founder and defender of the theocracy. They spoke to Jesus about his death, which was shortly to occur. It was an awful time to the disciples. It seemed to flash upon Peter's mind that Jesus was now about to declare openly that messiahship of his which Peter had so recently confessed, that on this mount he was about to fix the seat of his empire. With Moses and Elijah as his prime ministers, it was the prevalent belief of the Jews that Elijah was to preside and herald the Messiah, and bring back the pot of manna and Aaron's rod, settle the controversies between the Jewish schools, purify the people by some lustration, and hand the nation over to King Messiah. He seemed now about to begin this grand inauguration, but then on the instant he and Moses retire. Peter, in his general confusion and fright, blunders out a request to Jesus to be permitted to erect there such booths as the Jews were accustomed to put up in a temporary style for their feasts of tabernacles, so that Moses and Elijah might remain with Jesus and carry forward the great work. Before Jesus made any response, a bright cloud encircled them, and the disciples were so amazed and frightened as they entered the cloud. A new marvel broke on them. A voice sounded from the brightness, saying, "This is my Son, the Beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." The disciples fell on their faces and remained so until Jesus came and touched them and encouraged them to arise. When they found that they were alone with Jesus, whatever theory may be adopted as to the history, the effects upon the minds of the disciples is the important consideration. Whether it was a vision which all three saw continuously in all its parts, in a dream or whatever, being awake, they were in such a physical, intellectual, and spiritual state as altogether to have witnessed these phenomena. It is certain that there were impressions made upon them which had great influence subsequently upon their character and conduct. The surprising glory of Jesus, his constancy with the law and the prophets, the subjugation of Moses and Elijah to Jesus, his suffering of death, not vitiating his claims to the messiahship, were certainly represented with great power to the minds of these three representative and influential disciples, and by them brought to bear upon the whole body of the nearest followers of Jesus. But still, there were 2 perplexities created by this vision and by the words of their master. One was the being raised again from the dead as applied to Jesus. If he were the Messias, how could he die? Well, people thought the same thing with Muhammad, but they were told, you know, are you going to turn your backs just because the messengers died or killed or whatever? How could death have power over a being so glorious? Well, not whatever, but when I don't quite exactly remember the verse. How could death have a power over a being so glorious that the effulgence of his person rendered his very garments glistening? Well, this was not something that the typical people would have witnessed, but they never did find a satisfactory solution of that problem through the whole lifetime of their master, that he was in some mysterious manner to accomplish at Jerusalem something which might be represented as a death. They had gathered from the conversation of Moses and Elijah, but that he should really depart this life by dying, being virtually murdered, and that his spirit should come back to that same mangled body and lift it from the grave and go about in it as if he had never died, in a series of thoughts which seems never to have entered their minds. Now, if Jesus wasn't, just another incarnated human, that's sort of what it was. It was like some virtual reality game, and there was no real ultimate cost that would have had to been paid by him. And their second trouble was to reconcile the fact that they had seen Elijah leave Jesus, apparently not to return, with the prediction of Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6, that Elijah must first come, which, as their religious instructors had taught them to believe, meant that the personal appearance of the prophet Elijah, Eliyahu, was to precede that of the Messias. Here, he had shown himself to only 3 of the disciples, and not to the body of the people, and instead of preceding Jesus, had really appeared to no one until this late period in the ministry of Jesus. Their master gave them to understand that John the Baptist had fulfilled all predictions of a forerunner, that he had preceded Jesus with the power of Elijah, and had been slaughtered, and that the fate of the Baptist prefigured the sufferings which he himself was to endure. His own approaching death by violence seemed as plain before his eyes as that of John, which had already been accomplished. After these wonderful revelations, Jesus enjoined silence on the 3 witnesses. We can readily conjecture good reason for this. They had become so affected by this interview that they could carry the moral influence into the whole body of the disciples without the description of phenomena which might give rise to perplexing and inharmonious discussions. Everything was to be done which should suppress the sensuous messianic expectations of his followers. The very criticism made on this transaction by such men as Paulus and Venturini and Strauss in modern days shows just the spirit with which the narrative of such lofty scenes and experiences would have been met by the multitude and learned men of that time, who were generally coarse, skeptical, and profane. When no good can possibly come of speaking, and much evil may, it is wisdom to keep silence. Immediately upon the descent from the mountain occurred a scene which stands in contrast with the lofty splendor of the Transfiguration. Jesus came to the 9 disciples, whom he had left behind, found them in great trouble and perplexity, and the hostile scribes vexing them with questions, and the multitude about them in a tumult. But there must have been something in that natural dignity of the person of Jesus, and perhaps on this occasion some reminiscence of the glory wherewith he had shone in the eyes of his 3 disciples on the mount, for the people were amazed at his appearance and ran towards him and saluted him. Mark 9, Matthew 17, Luke 9. He asked them, Why do ye question among yourselves? The disciples gave no answer, nor the scribes. The former were ashamed of their weakness and the absence of their master. The latter feared his power now that he was present. The question, however, was soon answered by a man from the crowd, who came forward and kneeled down before Jesus and said, Teacher, I have brought to thee my son, mine only child, who has a dumb spirit, and where it seizes him, it tears him. And he suddenly cries out and foams and gnashes with his teeth and pines away, and the spirit with difficulty departs from him. And once control has been offered, and one way or another, it's not always so conscious. There can be difficulty with it fading away, but don't, when you work yourself into a state, just don't banish the states of ecstasy and all that other stuff. For he is a lunatic and sore vexed, and I spoke to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. Here was the whole case, with all its difficulties, revealed. Here was a spectacle of mental and physical wretchedness, an epileptic and lunatic youth. Well, wasn't really a epileptic if he was, if it was just the psychosomatic things of demonic possession, but whom the disciples had not power to heal. And because they failed when they tried, the party antagonistic to Jesus had stirred up the multitude to profane skepticism, and perhaps to taunts, rejecting their master in the persons of the disciples, who, under these jeers on account of their weakness, grew still more impotent. The contrast with the Mount of Transfiguration was violent. Rafaela's great picture in the Vatican presents to the eye the idea of the contrast, but fails to express it all. The mount was bright and warm, full of celestial health, harmonies, but here, in the plain, were physical disease and mental disorder and darkness, and clang of discordant voices and passions. It smote from the sensitiveness of Jesus the expression, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? What long pent-up agony inspired in that groan? He had lived to teach them that faith in God was everything as a basis of character and as an energy of life, and all seemed to come to nothing. He knew the power and goodness of God so well that want of trust in him on the part of others gave Jesus the greatest suffering. He could not endure it. It was not the sins into which their passions betrayed them that was most grievous, but the lack of faith which allowed their passions such power over their lives. Bring him to me, he said. And as they brought him, the boy had another fit, and he fell and wallowed foaming. And Jesus asked the father how long since this happened to him. And he answered, From a child. And often it has cast him into the fire and into the waters, and that it might destroy him. But if thou art able, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus replied, If thou art able, all things are possible to him who believes. There may be a doubt as to the precise shade of meaning which Jesus attached to these words, because we don't have it in Aramea. That's how you spell it in that language and pronounce it. But the emphasis makes great difference. If thou art able, would be quoting the man's words and rebuking them for the implication of inability on the part of Jesus. Repeating the man's words without any emphasizing would be to say, it is not a question of ability, physical or intellectual, but purely of faith. If I have faith enough, I can do this. If my disciples had faith enough, they might have done it. Both these meanings may be in the speech of Jesus, but I think that over them predominates the sense given by the words when emphasized as above. If thou, the father of the child, art able, no faith on the part of Jesus would have availed if the man remained unbelieving, and faith is strength. If thou art able to believe is the reply to if thou art able to cure. It is only the repetition of the teaching of Jesus that the greatest power of humanity lies in its trust in the Father God, the provider, the center. Returning to Northern Semitic speak, there's broader term meaning of this thing than just that this gives a man control over all the possibilities of the universe, and that things become possible to men in proportion to their faith, that as a man extends the radius of his faith, he enlarges the circle of his possibilities. Faith and love in the system of Jesus are the two great wings which bear a man upward through the universe to the highest attainments and enjoyments. The father must have felt that there was some rebuke in the reply of Jesus. He burst into tears and said, Sir, I believe. Do thou help mine unbelief. This is at once so natural, so simple, and so profound that every reader must feel he is perusing a narrative of actual events. The father believed that his unbelief was in the way of the healing of his child. He believed that Jesus could do something to destroy that unbelief. He prayed him to do it, so that at once his infidelity and his child's malady might be cured. If it was not the voice, it was at least the echo of faith. It was enough. By this time the people had begun to run together. He made no prayer, but said authoritatively, Dumb, deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. Gotta remember to look up that verse. That sounds pretty cool, right? And shrieking, and having greatly convulsed him, it left, and the boy lay as if he were dead, so much that some of the spectators pronounced him dead. But Jesus took his hand and raised him, and he stood up. So, the boy was convinced that, this dude here that did this, he's on the right path, and, then that has its effect, right? When they entered the house, his disciples privately asked him, the cause of their failure. He plainly traced it to their lack of faith. They then prayed, Lord, increase our faith. His reply was, if you have faith as a grain of mustard, ye might say to this sycamine tree, be rooted up and planted in the sea, and it would have obeyed you, or to this mountain, remove hence yonder, and it should obey you, and nothing should be impossible to you. He also said to them, this kind can come forth by nothing except by prayer. It was a strong expression of the value attached to faith by Jesus. Steer seldom said a more sensible thing than his comment on this passage. Faith cannot make it its concern, in a literal sense, to be removing mountains of the earth, but if it could be and ought to be its concern, then faith would be able, really, literally, to remove mountains, all the possibilities that are within the reach of faith. But if a man have not faith, even the possibilities become impossibilities. The removing of material mountains is a matter of small moment. It would be curious to stand on a peak of the Alps and see a spur of the mountain lifted by a word and set down quietly in a Swiss lake, but it would be nothing more, nothing useful or beautiful or profitable would be in it. A man who takes from his fellow men a mountain of doubt, of intellectual and spiritual difficulty, is greater, does a grander, wiser, better, lovelier thing. Very currently in the school of the rabbins was a remover of such difficulties, finally called an uprooter of mountains. And I'm reminded of the Yazidi practice of the tying and untying of knots, representing dealing with difficulties.